Hello, this is video number 14 and I will be reading part of my Glacier View article from the Adventist Crisis of Spiritual Identity. Some of it's the same as what you've heard, so I won't read everything. I've highlighted some things and I'll do that. But first, I wanted to mention about yesterday's video, number 13, where I talked about Heppenstall, trying to explain why he was sort of so up and down. He seemed to be for Des, he seemed to be against Des. And I mentioned Cottrell, and Cottrell took a meeting with very similar content at Andrews the week before Glacier View, and it was, I believe, for the faculty, and nobody took any notice. And the reason I mentioned Cottrell was because Cottrell used the Ellen White card. He said, well, we can't prove the investigative judgment from the Bible, but we can support it using Ellen White. And after Glacier View, he got quite a bit of flack from that, and eventually he gave up that argument. But I wondered whether Heppenstall was not the same when he saw the ramifications of what he and Des had been discussing for years. Did he think, well, to take this position, you've got to throw Ellen White out, the investigative judgment, 1844, 1798, all the dates, and he thought this was Des going off the deep end. But Des said eldest Dr. Heppenstall was not highly influenced by Ellen White. And it still, as I said yesterday, is hard to explain why he seemed to be against Des at Glacier View when they'd had correspondence since the 50s and had met at certain times. And he was always getting into trouble with the brethren. He told Des that, like, being a theology professor in the Adventist Church was like walking a minefield. So, anyway, that's tidying up that argument. Then I mentioned the difference between the traditional statement about the investigative judgment, what the pioneers believed, and what the Dallas statement changed. And here's the statement. It's in Positive Christian Living, but I think Des said it was originally Christ's Object Lessons, and this is a new version. And here's Ellen White saying, "It is while men are still dwelling upon the earth that the work of investigative judgment takes place in the courts of heaven. The lives of all his professed followers pass in review before God. All are examined according to the record of the books of heaven, and according to his deeds, the destiny of each is forever fixed." So that is the original view on the investigative judgment, and the Dallas statement written before Glacier View in the early months of, I think, about March 1980, took the position that the little horn was Antichrist and that judgment took place against the wicked, not the saints. There's a big difference between those. So anyway, that clears that up. And there was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten what it was. So in this article, which I wrote 18 months after Glacier View, as I say, there's some things that are the same that I'm going to try and leave out, and other places where I add bits or new information that might be of interest to some. So this is Friday morning. Des and I were asked to leave while the third statement, the 10-point statement, was discussed. it was treated differently to the others, which fact we only found out much later. For instance, the 10-point statement was not duplicated, probably due to lack of time. Now I think it was intentional, and put in the delegates' hands, but only read out from the front. At least 2 men stood up and made the comment that it did not represent the views of everybody there. It was not voted on. And the reason later given for this was that the administrators wished to discuss it with Des first. And note also that a lot of the attendees had left the previous night and so did not get to hear that statement that morning. And I've mentioned to you before, when Des read the first consensus statement, he was quite elated. He told me he could live with that statement. He said it was a great improvement on our past positions and was going in the right direction. He believed it included some of the views of his Glacier View manuscript, though these views were not original with Des. In the Friday afternoon meeting, and I'm missing some sentences out here because they're similar to what I've already said, the 10-point statement was used to show that the scholars almost en masse disagreed with Des. Said Elder Wilson, maybe 1 or 2 agree with you, but that is all. Examples were cited of those who disagreed. Dr. Heppenstall was said to have arrived supporting Des but left upset with him and saying that Des did not have doctrinal but psychological problems. And Elder Parmenter quoted Dr. Hans Larendella stating that he differed with Des, and so on. Different to what Hans said to us. So here's what I said 18 months afterwards about the 4-point letter that Parmenter wrote. We felt these 4 affirmations were more strongly expressed than the copy of the letter which was later typed and given to us and published in official papers. 2 of the points had to do with public statements that Des must make if he wished to remain in the work. One was in connection with Bob Brinsmead. Des was required to publicly denounce him. The other required that Des not only state in the review that he, Des, was in error, but he must change his mind and teach traditional views. An Australian administrator who talked to Elder Parmenter at length about this on his return to Australia assured us that this was what was required. I think this was probably Dr. Eric Magnuson, but I'm not positive. Des must change his mind. Des's reaction to the 10-point statement was that it contained no evidence. In response to this, Elder Bob Spangler said that this was true, but that the ministry was going to put out a whole edition which would give the required evidence. Des responded, well, I hope I see it before publication, and we were told that he would. The facts are that we did not see it prior to publication. We received a copy a week after other friends of ours, not a pre-publication copy, but the ministry itself. I know they took Des off the mailing list, and by that time Des had officially been ousted from his position. The action had already gone through Prexad and the Australasian Division when that ministry of September 1980 came out. I say here that I believe this was an oversight and not intentional, but that I felt it was the most unfair event at Glacier View. But these men thought they were right and Des was wrong. I mention here again, in a plenary session the day before, in an interchange with Dr. Jack Prevoncha, Elder Parmenter had said that if a man could not affirm the Dallas statement, he should hand in his credentials. Nothing to do with the consensus. We were told not to rush into a decision. We're given 2 weeks to think about it. Because Des made a sudden decision that was considered unyielding and rash. Some said we didn't even pray about it, but we did pray before the meeting that the Lord would make it crystal clear as to what we should do. But the terms that Elder Parmenter gave were to our minds so unequivocal that Des felt, were he given decades, he could not just change his mind and say he was in error. You have to understand that such men as Bob Spangler felt that Des had been given a great deal of evidence in the meetings prior to Glacier View. A smaller committee had met on 6 different occasions before Glacier View after the first writing of the document to help Des by offering suggestions to him and criticism of his presentations. These men met for a total of about 50 hours on the 6 occasions, 1 meeting per chapter, and they were supposed to write reports on each chapter. From Des's viewpoint, most of the 50 hours in which the committee met, most people spoke for 3 to 8 minutes in total. That's over the whole 6 meetings. Some didn't speak at all. Only a few people spoke on repeated occasions and at length. These included Dr. Hazel, Dr. Gerhard Stamstedt, and of course Dr. Hamill, the chairman of the committee, who had made a large contribution. Des feels that the tapes of all those 6 meetings will eventually, if they are ever released, exonerate him with testimony that not much compelling evidence was given. As for the written reports, some wrote only 1 report, others were brief, and still others were almost wholly negative. Most of them did not deal with the major issues. And Dr. Bill Johnson was a shining exception. Where he disagreed, he was fair. And then I go on to Robert Brinsmead and his mention at Glacier View. He and his views were not mentioned in the committee at large, but he was there in the Friday afternoon meeting. I don't mean really there, but they talked about him a great deal. Elder Wilson and the men from the Australasian Division could not understand why Des had allowed Bob Brinsmead to send out thousands of the October 1979 tape, nor why Des would not publicly dissociate himself from Bob. And I've mentioned before that Bob didn't send out the tapes. That was a false tale, probably from John Brinsmead. Des felt that public dissociation from Bob was a political manoeuvre, one which would dishonour the gospel, which he and Bob agreed on. Concerning the sending out of tapes, Des was not ashamed of what he'd said on October the 27th, and he's never tried to stop anybody sending out any of his tapes. He did not instigate the sending out of the tapes, and neither was he asked permission to do so. Though Des has been repeatedly charged with being in league with Bob, it is completely false that they have ever plotted to destroy the church. I've been present several times at their mutual discussions. It's almost wholly theological content. Many times, Des and Bob have disagreed in the past, and they don't agree on everything now, as the Sabbath controversy has shown. But they've treated each other as Christian gentlemen, shown each other a mutual respect. Though Bob was not mentioned a great deal at Glacier View itself, I couldn't help thinking that Robert Brinsmead and fear of him were to some degree responsible for the pressure the Australasian division apparently put on GC to relieve Des of his job. On the next day, I was rebuked for spreading the rumour that Des had been fired. I didn't use the word fired, as it was rather harsh, and I believe I represented what happened fairly and without bitterness. Here is why I thought Des was relieved of his job. Maybe not technically, but surely enough. In the first place, when Elder Parmenter said that if Des could not affirm the 4 points in his letter, he, Parmenter, should not have to ask for his credentials, Des should hand them in. Des stated he could not so affirm. At that point he was asked to resign, but refused to do so. In the Prexad meeting on the Friday afternoon, Elder Parmenter told us that he'd already spoken to Lance Butler, the General Conference Treasurer, and that we need not fear. Our bread and water would be sure. Our way paid back to Australia, we would be given some month's wages. Elder Parmenter explained later to others that he wished merely to assure Des of financial support, whatever his decision. But I think you can understand why we interpret it the way we did. In private, after the meeting, Elder Parmenter asked Des what he would do now. Des said he didn't know. Elder Parmenter said, "I'd offer you a job in the SHF, the Australasian Food Factory, but I know it wouldn't suit you." This was spoken quite sympathetically. With a smile, Elder Parmenter said that this was the worst week of his life, and I say here that I believed him. Note also that the report in the review implied that Des had been terminated at that Friday afternoon meeting, and while it's true that the Friday committee could not make the decision to take away Des's credentials, the after history seems to bear up our impressions. I was accused of being over-emotional, exaggerating, phoning out to Australia, which I didn't do, and relaying information to Bob Brinsmead, which I didn't do. It's true that I was upset on the Friday afternoon and later, and I cried during the Friday afternoon meeting. So did some of the men, but they didn't mention that. I felt they didn't understand what Des was trying to say. I felt he'd been very loyal. What they'd done was unfair. But I didn't slander them in any way. I tried to be fair. I don't think I exaggerated. The news had been relayed to Australia on the Wednesday of that week that Des had been fired. Well, it didn't come from me. Wednesday. Wouldn't even think it had happened until Friday. I rang nobody that day on Tuesday. So the message couldn't have come from me. I didn't call anybody on the Tuesday night. After the interaction between Elder Wilson and Des on the Tuesday, many felt it was all over, but I didn't relay that idea to anyone. As I say, I never rang Australia. We didn't have the money to make phone calls to Australia. On Friday evening, I called 5 people, one at General Conference. I don't know who that was. I have to think about that. An Australian in Oregon, that was Ray Martin, and 3 friends in California. That was probably Noel Mason, the Kimes, and Dean Jennings, I'd say. I didn't have any contact with Bob Brinsmead at Glacier View or for ages before or afterwards. And I've said before, I've had less to do with Bob than Des had, and I didn't collude with him. But I've never liked the attitude of a lot of people in the church towards Bob. So looking at the question of when the basic decision was made about Des's future, it seems to us that it was decided before any of us arrived at Glacier View. The decision to stick to the Dallas statement had been made, and Des's only option was to conform or he was out. Now, I don't have this anywhere else in my videos. Several leading men at GC stated that Des was going to be fired prior to Glacier View. Elder Dower was reported on 3 occasions to state that Des would have to go. He told Dr. Heppenstall this at Soquel camp meeting a week before Glacier View. He also told a group of ministers there. He spoke similarly to a worker in Puerto Rico. Elder Bob Olson said the same in Europe, according to relatives in US and Australia of believers over there in Europe. Elder Delafield told a taxi driver, I've told this story before, driving him from Denver Airport to Glacier View, that Des was going to be fired. The taxi driver was not an Adventist, but he was a verdict reader. He signed an affidavit that this conversation was true. C.D. Brooks in Australia said the same thing in a South Australian workers' meeting. There were other incidents, but I forget the names and places. I'll finish there and continue on the next video.